They call me infidel. How strange! I see no lines that faith can rearrange. In all the world no dual thing I see. So tell me, what is faith and what is heresy? Who was the author of this quatrain? A poet, for whom the boundaries between creeds were illusionary, a mystic for whom non-dualism and apophatic vision weren't just poetic metaphors, they were his lived reality. Let's explore the story of Sarmad, the naked saint of Mughal India.
I'm Andy Altshuler, and this is Echoes of Heresy, a podcast about spiritual descent and divergent beliefs across time and tradition.
Before we begin, a brief note on the pronunciation of our hero's name. Throughout the episode, I'll be using the Persian pronunciation, with the stress on the final syllables of each word, Sarmad Kashani. That reflects how his name is spoken in Farsi, the language he spoke and in which he wrote, and the cultural linguistic world he came from. English speakers might naturally default to something like Sarmad Kashani. I'm aware that in South Asia, where Sarmad ultimately lived and died, and where his legacy is very much known and revered, his name is also pronounced somewhat like Sarmad Kashani or Kashani. All of these forms are understandable and perfectly legitimate within their contexts. But since Persian was the primary language of Sarmad's poetry and philosophical expression, and I'll admit, since this also aligns closely with how his name is rendered in Russian, my own native language, I've chosen to retain the Persian stress and the vowel lengths here. I hope listeners from other backgrounds who might be used to a different pronunciation will accept this intentional choice as both respectful and, I believe, justified. To understand Sarmad, we need to understand the world he walked naked through. The Mughal Empire, at its height in the 17th century, was one of the most powerful and culturally sophisticated states in the world. Founded in 1526 by Babur, a Central Asian descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, the empire by Sarmad's time stretched from Kandahar in the west to Bengal in the east, and from Himalayas in the north to the Deccan Plateau in the south. It governed over 100 million people, a population greater than that of all of Europe at the time. Its ruling class was Persian-speaking, deeply influenced by Islamic, Turkic, and Timurid traditions, and yet ruling over a majority Hindu population. The result was not only tension, there was also a vibrant, albeit often unstable synthesis of cultures, and a court life rich with art, architecture, poetry, and spiritual experimentation. This was a time when the empire was flush with wealth, some of it flowing from trade with the Islamic world, Europe, and East Asia. In fact, Mughal India accounted for nearly a quarter of global GDP in the 1600s, more than the entire Ottoman Empire or Ming China. It was also a world steeped in a religious ferment. Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, had long taken root in India, with shrines that drew both Muslims and Hindus. Bhakti movements were sweeping through village and city alike, rejecting ritualism and caste system in favor of direct devotion. Sikhism, still a young faith, was crystallizing its identity under increasing pressure from Mughal authority. And Vedanta, the non-dualist Hindu philosophy, was quietly influencing thinkers across sectarian lines. The court itself could be surprisingly open to these currents. Akbar the Great, whose long reign lasted from 1556 to 1605, turned Mughal court into an arena for interfaith dialogue. He even tried to launch a new spiritual movement, the Din-i-Ilahi, or religion of God, inspired by what he saw as the shared truths behind all religions. A generation later, Dara Shikoh, Akbar's great-grandson, inherited that spirit of inquiry. He saw no contradiction between the Quran and the Upanishads, and he envisioned a pluralistic empire rooted in mystical unity rather than legalistic division. But the tide was turning. The growing power of conservative religious scholars, the ulama, was beginning to reshape the atmosphere. When Dara's more hardline brother, Aurangzeb, seized power in 1658, he would bring with him a new, harsher orthodoxy. The empire that once encouraged debate and diversity would begin to suppress it. And it's here, right in the tension between openness and repression, between spiritual wildness and imperial control, that Sarmad appears. A man who stood both within and far beyond the intellectual world of the Mughals. Sarmad is said to be born in the 1590s. His birthplace is not definitively certain in historical sources. Some sources specifically identify Armenia as his birthplace, while others describe him as coming from Kashan, or at least having grown up there, which explains the surname Kashani, meaning from Kashan. The biographical records do not offer a precise consensus and reflect this ambiguity without confirming a single location for his birth. According to most early accounts, including Muslim biographers like Muhammad Qasim Lahori, Sarmad was born into a family of Jewish merchants, and he is often referred to as Yahudi, a Jew, even after his formal conversion to Islam and later transformation into a wandering mystic. He was also, we are told, of Armenian descent. At least Ma'asir al-Umara, Mughal chronicle, refers to him as such. Now, how do we make sense of that? Modern scholars, such as Walter Fischl and Nahid Bernazar, tend to dismiss Sarmad's supposed Armenian ancestry as a likely error, perhaps the result of the Mughal court chronicler's unfamiliarity with the complex ethnic and linguistic landscape of central Iran. In their view, labeling him Armenian may have stemmed from superficial assumptions based on his name or profession or roughly the places he was coming from, rather than from any solid biographical data. Still, the detail is too evocative to ignore entirely. So let's pause for a moment, not to blur fact and fiction, but to indulge in some informed speculation. Kashan, then as now, was a city of cultural layers. Located in central Iran, it sat along major trade routes, and it housed significant minority communities, including Armenians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, all of whom lived there for centuries under varying degrees of Safavid control. In addition to that, in the early 17th century, during a fierce conflict with the Ottoman Empire, Shah Abbas I of the Safavid dynasty undertook a drastic and strategic move To protect his borders and strengthen his empire, he forcibly relocated tens of thousands of Armenians from eastern Anatolia, regions like Julfa and the Ararat Valley, deep into central Iran. This mass resettlement, affecting around 250,000 Armenians, led to the creation of New Julfa, an Armenian quarter in Isfahan. Although it was a traumatic journey for many, this community flourished in their new home, becoming a vital center of trade and culture within the Safavid Empire. Some families found their way into cities like Kashan as traders or artisans, and likely further shaped the ethnic and linguistic patchwork of the area. These Armenians were primarily Christian, members of the ancient Armenian Apostolic Church. But history is rarely tidy. There were also Jewish communities in historic Armenia, dating back centuries, so it's quite possible, though not certain, that Sarmad's family was linguistically Armenian but religiously Jewish, tracing their roots to all the diasporas in eastern Anatolia or the Caucasus. Could his family have been converts from Christianity to Judaism? Unlikely, but not entirely impossible. Or Jewish merchants who had intermarried with Armenians? Again, we don't know. But what we can say is that ethnic and religious identities, especially outside the Muslim Ummah, in the early modern Middle East, were often entangled, and a person like Sarmad could very well have grown up navigating multiple codes, linguistic, cultural, religious, from the start. What might it have meant to be mistaken for an Armenian in 17th century Kashan? Armenians, many of them Christian, some possibly new converts to Islam, were known through Safavid Iran for their mercantile acumen and multilingualism. Jews, too, had ancient roots in Kashan, often involved in trade, scholarship, and occasionally crafts or medicine. Cultural interpenetration was not only possible but common, particularly among merchant families. Even if Sarmad was not Armenian by descent, it's entirely plausible that he was fluent in Armenian and well acquainted with its rich literary tradition, particularly through his manuscript trade. His livelihood and intellectual curiosity would have brought him into contact with texts and people across confessional lines. Armenian Christian texts, Jewish mysticism, Islamic philosophy, these were not necessarily separate worlds for someone like Sarmad. So perhaps the misidentification reflects something deeper, that Sarmad lived on the boundaries in a space of cultural and religious hybridity, a space that would prepare him more than most to dissolve boundaries entirely when he stepped into India. Early Muslim biographers, including Lahori and later writers, speak of Sarmad as a Jewish scholar and poet, well versed in Hebrew, Persian, and Arabic. They emphasize his deep knowledge of Jewish scriptures, possibly including Kabbalistic traditions, though this is more inferred than stated. Dr. Nahid Parnazar writes, quote, "In spite of the massive forced conversions of Jews, as well as non-Shiite Muslims during the Safavids, there is no evidence to suggest that Sarmad historically or intellectually could belong to any of such forced converted groups, since his conversion was voluntary and took place at least 4 years before the first round of Jewish conversions in 1619. However, having left Iran in 1632, he must have witnessed the forced conversions of Jews, during the reign of Shah Abbas I. Sarmad's exposure and interest in spirituality and mysticism may have had different causes. It could have resulted from the hardship he experienced in his environment, his education, the nature of his character, or all of the above. Sarmad's knowledge of the Jewish Kabbalah is not clear either. Although he was a contemporary of Rabbi Moshe Levi, a Kabbalist at the time of Shah Abbas I, we have thus far no proof that Sarmad had exposure to Kabbalistic thoughts, and if he had, what the consequences would have been. End quote. We do not know his Jewish name. We know that he probably adopted the name Muhammad in the time of his conversion to Islam before his arrival in India, while Sarmad was his literary pseudonym, which meant eternal or perennial in Persian. After his conversion, Sarmad had the rare good fortune of studying with two of the greatest minds of his time, Mullah Sadra and Mir Fendereski, both major figures of what's known as the School of Isfahan, a kind of philosophical movement that blended deep metaphysical thinking with mystical insight. While we cannot know for certain, it's reasonable to assume that when Sarmad formally converted to Islam, it was within the tradition of 12 Rashis, the intellectual world of his teachers, and the dominant form of Islam in Safavid Iran. From Mir Fendereski, Sarmad picked up a solid grounding in rational philosophy, a love of reasoning, big questions, and willingness to draw from different traditions. But it was Mullah Sadra who really lit the spark that sent Sarmad down a more mystical path. Sadra's illuminationist philosophy, which focused on inner truth and spiritual experience, clearly struck a chord with him. Like his teacher Mullah Sadra, Sarmad would later face accusations of unorthodoxy, of crossing the line with his mystical ideas. And there is another layer too. Mir Fendereski, another of his mentors, was known for pushing boundaries in his own way. He was famous for his disheveled appearance, his disregard for rigid religious rituals, and his travels to India, where he engaged with Hindu and Zoroastrian thought and translated Sanskrit texts into Persian. It's not hard to imagine that all of this rubbed off on Sarmad, not just in how he thought, but in how he lived, unorthodox, boundary-crossing, and spiritually restless. His command of Persian literary forms, especially the ghazal, is evident from his surviving poetry. We know from his verses that he was conversant with Sufi vocabulary, Quranic references, and Islamic theological debates even before his formal rupture from Judaism. Some sources claim Sarmad translated the Torah into Persian, though whether this is literal or symbolic is debated. If true, it would position him within a broader tradition of inter-religious textual transmission. This kind of background, ethnically mixed, religiously liminal, and intellectually multilingual, may have uniquely prepared Sarmad for what came next. In an age where identities were often tightly guarded, Sarmad seems to have moved fluidly between them. Where others saw contradiction, he saw continuity. Where others sought religious certainty, he cultivated paradox. His early life in Kashan was not yet that of a wandering mystic. It was the life of a merchant. Like many Jews and Armenians of the region, he was dealing in luxury goods, textiles, and, importantly, manuscripts. And it was through this career that he made his fateful journey. He traveled to India, bringing goods, and perhaps more crucially, inner questions. Because somewhere along the way, the merchant disappeared and the mystic was born. Once in India, Sarmad's life takes a profound turn, a transformation both spiritual and personal. The turning point comes in Thatta, the port city in Sindh, then part of the Mughal Empire. It's here that he meets Abhai Chand, and the encounter changes everything. Abhai Chand was likely a young Hindu man, possibly from a Rajput background, part of the warrior nobility of northern India. Though, as with much of Sarmad's life, the details are elusive and often shaped by later storytelling. Some accounts describe him as noble-born, others simply as a student or seeker. He would have spoken Sindhi, possibly Persian too, and likely had some exposure to Bhakti devotionalism, a current in Hindu spirituality that emphasized personal love for the divine, often expressed in poetic and emotional terms. Sarmad's bond with Abhai Chand is usually described as one of deep love and spiritual connection. Whether it was romantic, platonic, or something that transcended easy categories, it clearly shook Sarmad to his core. It opened him to a completely different way of being. After this encounter, Sarmad abandons trade. He lets go of his role as a Jewish Persian merchant and gradually distances himself from any fixed religious identity. He stops observing formal rituals. Eventually, he even casts off his clothes, choosing to roam India naked. But his nakedness wasn't about spectacle. It was an existential statement, a rejection of illusion, pretense, and attachment. In shedding his garments, Sarmad was symbolically stripping away ego, culture, even self. He refused to wear the costumes of religion, nationality, or social status. His nakedness became a way of saying, I belong to no one, I follow no system, I seek only truth. This gesture shocked many, fascinated others, and confused most, but it was consistent with a deep inner logic, a radical honesty, a refusal to hide behind symbols, creeds, or robes. According to Madan Gopal Gupta, a modern biographer of Sarmad, Abhai Chand played a pivotal role in introducing Sarmad to Hindu cultural and spiritual concepts. In return, Sarmad shared with Abhai Chand his knowledge of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, along with languages like Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian. Out of deep affection for his mentor, Abhai Chand eventually converted to Islam. However, Gupta notes that the conversion was largely symbolic, for neither Sarmad nor Abhai Chand truly adhered to any formal religion in a strict sense. At some point during his life in India, likely in the mid-17th century, Sarmad crossed paths with Prince Dara Shikoh, the heir apparent to the Mughal throne and one of the most intellectually adventurous figures of his time. The exact circumstances of their meeting are lost to history, but several sources suggest it happened in Delhi, possibly during Sarmad's increasingly visible presence in the capital as a wandering, naked mystic whose reputation had begun to attract attention. Dara, ever curious about holy men regardless of creed, is said to have sought Sarmad out personally, drawn by the stories of his spiritual depth, unorthodox style, and powerful charisma. What followed was more than a passing encounter. Dara, known for his own Sufi leanings and deep engagement with Hindu philosophy, likely saw in Sarmad a kind of living embodiment of what he most cherished, a faith that transcended boundaries. He had already befriended Hindu sages, studied under Muslim mystics, and translated the Upanishads into Persian. Sarmad, a former Jew of Persian and possibly Armenian background, now immersed in the spiritual language of India, fit perfectly into Dara's syncretic world. Some accounts portray Sarmad as Dara's spiritual mentor or advisor, while others are more cautious, noting only a close association. But what's clear is that they deeply influenced each other. Dara may have found in Sarmad a source of mystical insight that went beyond the formal boundaries of Sufism. And Sarmad likely found in Dara a rare kind of interlocutor, a prince who was not only powerful, but also genuinely spiritually curious, even daring. Sarmad's spiritual friendship with Prince Dara Shikoh, a poet, mystic, and seeker of religious unity, placed him at the very heart of Mughal India's boldest experiment in pluralism. Their bond wasn't just personal, it was ideological. Both men defied religious orthodoxy in search of deeper truths, and both imagined a spiritual landscape in which Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, and undefined mystical ideas might converse, rather than compete. It's within this circle, around Dara Shikoh and his intellectual milieu, that we encounter one of the era's most extraordinary texts, the Dabestane Mazaheb, or School of Religious Doctrines. Written in Persian sometime between 1655 and 1658, the Dabestan presents a rich and open-minded account of the world's religious traditions, from Vedanta to Judaism, from Sufism to Zoroastrianism, many of them described in unusually empathetic and well-informed detail. Its anonymous author refers to himself as a Zoroastrian of the Iranian diaspora, but beyond speculation about possible authorship, one historical figure is explicitly credited as a key source, Sarmad Kashani. In the section on Judaism, the author openly states that his knowledge came directly from Sarmad, describing him as a former Jew of Rabbanite background, fluent in Hebrew, who had converted to Islam and become a mystic wanderer. The author recounts meeting Sarmad in Hyderabad around 1647 and relying on him and a Hindu disciple of his for the translation and explanation of a portion of the Torah. The chapter on Judaism explicitly acknowledges Sarmad's contributions, making him one of the few individuals directly named and cited in the entire Dabestan. His fluency in Jewish mysticism, his command of Hebrew, and his unorthodox yet deeply informed views were instrumental in shaping one of the earliest Persian treatments of Judaism, including some Kabbalistic concepts from within the subcontinent. More broadly, the Dabistan's tone, curious, non-dogmatic, and profoundly inclusive, closely mirrors Sarmad's own writings and public persona. The text resonates with many of his preoccupations: the limits of language, the vanity of religious exclusivity, and the shared truths hidden within divergent traditions. As scholar Nahid Parnazar points out, even beyond the Judaism chapter, Sarmad's intellectual presence can be felt throughout the Dabistan, particularly in its treatments of Persian religions and other minority traditions. In that sense, the Dabistan becomes not just a record of pluralism, but a textual echo of Sarmad's voice, a document animated by the very spirit he embodied. In this context, scholars have also explored Sarmad's possible influence on Dara Shikoh's own most famous philosophical work, the Majma'ul Bahrain, the confluence of the two oceans. This text, written in Persian, seeks to demonstrate the essential unity of Sufi metaphysics and Advaita Vedanta, Muslim and Hindu mystical teachings. Although the work's primary focus is on the confluence of Sufi Islam and Hindu Vedanta, Dara Shikoh also makes passing references to other traditions in the manner of Islamic heresiographers, but not necessarily with negative connotations. These remarks are brief rather than systematic, but they reveal his broader, universalist perspective. They also clearly reflect someone deeply familiar with them, someone able to bridge these traditions both conceptually and linguistically. This has led scholars to suggest that Sarmad may have played a role in shaping or informing these parts of Majma', considering his Jewish heritage, Persian upbringing, and mystical insight. He was uniquely positioned to offer Dara the kind of interreligious understanding that permeates the text. Even if his involvement was informal through conversation, commentary, or oral teaching, his presence is deeply felt. Together, Dara and Sarmad embodied a brief moment in Indian history when the boundaries between religions became porous, sometimes even luminous, but that moment was fleeting. Dara's defeat by his brother Aurangzeb and Sarmad's later execution would mark the suppression of that mystical, pluralistic vision. For while Dara saw Sarmad as a saint, Aurangzeb saw only heresy. In the end, both men would pay the price. With Aurangzeb's ascent to the throne in 1658, the tolerant and mystical vision of Dara gave way to strict Sunni orthodoxy. The Mughal court, that once entertained dialogues between Sufis, Yogis, Buddhists, Christians, and Jews, now turned on those same figures, branding them as infidels and traitors. Sarmad, with his cryptic poetry, public nakedness, and refusal to align with any single creed, had long drawn the ire of conservative clerics. But now, as a known associate of Dara Shikoh, he was especially vulnerable. The order came, arrest him. When brought to court, the charges against Sarmad were not merely symbolic. According to surviving records, 9 specific accusations were leveled against him. First, heretical statements, denying core Islamic tenets. Second, failure to recite the full Shahada, suggesting disbelief in Muhammad's prophethood. Third, public nudity, considered a violation of public decency and Islamic modesty. Fourth, influence over Abhai Chand, allegedly leading the young man astray from Islam. Fifth, claiming divine inspiration, possibly even prophetic status. Sixth, refusal to observe religious rituals, including prayer and fasting. Seventh, association with other heretics and religious deviants. Eighth, disrupting public order through provocative speech and conduct. Ninth, poetic blasphemy, namely verses that seemed to parody or challenge Quranic ideas. These were not minor eccentricities in the eyes of the court. They were existential threats to the ideological order Aurangzeb sought to impose. Among the charges brought against Sarmad by Aurangzeb court, indecency featured prominently. After all, here stood man, naked, unrepentant, and unashamed, on the steps of the empire's Grand Mosque. But for Sarmad, nudity wasn't shameful, it was revelatory. In his own defense, he pointed out that Islam does not regard nudity itself as a sin, and more provocatively, he drew on scripture. That mode of life was not totally forbidden, he said, for the prophet Isaiah used to go about naked in his old age. For Sarmad, nakedness wasn't a spectacle, it was an existential statement, a stripping away of illusion, a refusal to hide behind pretense or cloth. He even put the paradox into a verse. He who gave thee the kingly crown provided me with all sorts of vexations. He grants dress to sinners to hide their sins. To the immaculate, he only gives the garment of nudity. In these lines, nudity becomes a symbol of purity, not exposure, but radical transparency. The divine gives robes to those with something to cover, but to those who stand bare before truth, he offers only the sky and the skin. But again, the metaphysical subtlety was lost on the court. To them, this was defiance of decency and decorum, another sign of madness, heresy, or both. Among the most controversial charges was Sarmad's alleged denial of the Prophet Muhammad's physical ascension to heaven, the Miraj. For the clerics of Aurangzeb's court, this was not a philosophical disagreement, it was outright heresy. The Miraj was not just sacred history, it was theological bedrock. But Sarmad's worldview had little room for such literal distinctions. Steeped in the philosophy of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, he saw divine presence everywhere and in everything. Heaven wasn't a place above, it was a reality already present, shimmering behind the veil of appearances. In his poetic retort to the clergy, Sarmad is said to have replied, "He who understood the secret of the truth became vaster than the vast heaven. Mullah says, Ahmad went to heaven. Sarmad says, nay, heaven came down to Ahmad." This wasn't mere wordplay, it was a metaphysical claim. In Sufi tradition, Ahmad and Muhammad are not interchangeable labels, but two facets of a single reality. Both names derive from the same triliteral root, ha, mim, dal, meaning to praise. Muhammad, the praised one, refers to the Prophet's earthly manifestation, the man among men, praised by creation. Ahmad, the most praiseworthy, appears in the Quran itself, Surah 61, Ayah 6, where Jesus foretells the coming of a messenger named Ahmad. In mystical exegesis, this name points to the prophet's primordial, heavenly nature, his eternal essence before creation, the Nur Muhammadi, or Mohammedan light through which the cosmos came into being. By invoking Ahmad, Sarmad aligned himself with this esoteric lineage of interpretation. His verse turns the orthodox narrative of ascent inside out. The prophet's greatness, he suggests, was not in traveling upward toward heaven, but in becoming the vessel through which the infinite descended into the finite. Heaven rises to meet the human only because the divine had already stooped into the human form. In Sarmad's mystical cosmology, Ahmad represents the point where heaven and earth meet, the moment when the uncreated speaks through creation. The motion is not vertical but reciprocal, not spatial but ontological. He inverts the literal story not to deny Muhammad but to reveal the eternal dimension hidden within his name. But nuance rarely survives in courtrooms. To the judges, Sarmad's refusal to accept a literal mirage, his cryptic half-shahada, and his wild appearance sealed his fate. When pressed to publicly reaffirm his faith by reciting the Shahada, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, Sarmad stopped halfway. He recited only La ilaha. There is no God. The silence that followed was deafening. Asked why he would not complete the phrase, Sarmad calmly replied, I am still absorbed in the negation. When I reach the affirmation, I will speak it. This wasn't obstinacy, it was mysticism, a deep, apophatic stance reflecting the belief that the knowledge of God begins where human words end. He could not affirm that he had not yet realized inwardly. But to the clerics, this was unpardonable. Denying or even delaying affirmation of Muhammad's prophethood amounted to apostasy. In 1661, Sarmad was executed by beheading in Delhi, at the foot of Jama Masjid, the imperial mosque built by Shah Jahan, which had become a symbol of orthodox triumph under Aurangzeb. Legend says that after his head was severed, his body stood, picked it up, and walked, still whispering, La ilaha, a defiant image echoing through the centuries. After Sarmad's execution, Abhay Chand, his devoted companion, student, perhaps lover, largely disappears from the historical record. Some accounts hint that he may have carried forward Sarmad's message quietly, perhaps gathering disciples of his own. Others suggest he simply vanished, consumed by grief or caution in an empire that had turned hostile to everything Sarmad stood for. Whatever the truth, the memory of the two, inseparable in life, is preserved in story and song. Over time, Sarmad's radical path attracted a following. Though no formal order or sect seemed to have grown around him, his poetry and legend endured passed from hand to hand among seekers, Sufis, poets, and dissenters. His tomb in Delhi, just steps from the towering Jama Masjid, remains a magnet for pilgrims of every background. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, even secular wanderers come to pay respects not to a saint of one tradition, but to a mystic who transcended them all. They come for the poetry too, aphoristic, painfully honest. He spoke not from a polished pulpit, but from a raw edge of spiritual experience. In recent years, scholars have sought to make sense of this defiant figure through many different lenses. Some, like Madan Gopal Gupta, explore Sarmad in the context of Mughal India, painting him as a spiritual maverick shaped by an age of religious experimentation and imperial intrigue. Writers such as Muzaffar Alam and Sanjay Subramaniam, while focused more on the court of Dara Shikoh, provide a rich context for understanding the vibrant and volatile world Sarmad inhabited. Others place him within the wider tradition of Islamic heterodoxy. In this view, Sarmad is part of a lineage of mystics who resisted dogma and power, insisting on personal union with the divine. Scholars like Karl Ernst and Omid Safi explore these traditions where Sufism overflows the rigid boundaries set by religious establishment and becomes an existential challenge to orthodoxy. Then there are those who return to his Jewish background. Was Sarmad raised in a Persian Jewish household? Did he study Hebrew? And how well was he fluent? Did he really translate the Torah into Persian? What was his exposure to Kabbalah and other mystical currents of Judaism? Scholars like Walter Fischl and Nahid Parnazar explore this aspect in detail. In the 21st century, Sarmad has also found a place in queer studies. His relationship with Abhay Chand, loving, intense, and openly defiant of convention, has been explored as an early example of queerness within a spiritual and poetic frame. Thinkers like Salim Kidwai, working on gender and sexuality in South Asia, interpret Sarmad's life as a challenge to rigid binaries, religious, social, and sexual. And then, of course, there is Sarmad the poet. Scholars of Persian like Sunil Sharma and Ali Asani note how Sarmad's voice resists easy classification. His quatrains don't flow with courtly elegance, they erupt with raw insight, sometimes ironic, often mystical, always unsettling. Later translations into Urdu and Hindi left their mark on poetical forms and literary traditions of the Indian subcontinent. Sarmad Kashani is not a figure who gives easy answers, but for those today who are suspicious of religious certainty and drawn to spiritual experimentation, he remains a startling, beautiful, and uncompromising presence. If you're enjoying Echoes of Heresy and want to help keep it going, consider supporting the show, whether by sharing it with others, leaving a review, or making a contribution, if you're able to. Independent projects like these rely on curious minds and generous spirits. Every bit of support helps me research, write, and produce future episodes exploring the forgotten, the forbidden, and the profound. Sarmad's story leaves us with a haunting question. What happens when a person's inner truth runs up against the machinery of religious authority? That tension between personal revelation and institutional power isn't unique to Mughal India. It echoes across time and cultures. In our next episode, we turn to a very different world, late 19th century Russia. There, another seeker, This time a count, a novelist, a national icon would find himself excommunicated by the Orthodox Church. Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, spent the final decades of his life wrestling with the Church over the meaning of Christ's message. The Church called him a heretic. He claimed the Church had betrayed the Gospel. Like Sarmad, Tolstoy stood naked, morally, intellectually, before power. And like Sarmad, he left behind a spiritual legacy that still unsettles and inspires.